Everyone froze when the wild rescue dog suddenly broke free of his chain. The ground seemed to shake as his massive paws slammed into the dirt, his snarl ripping through the dry Arizona air like a crack of thunder. No one expected what happened next, especially when a small barefoot boy stepped forward from a terrified crowd, his torn backpack hanging loosely over one shoulder. What happened in the next 10 seconds would change everything in the small town of Redstone forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you believe that animals have souls and that miracles can happen in the most unexpected places, please hit that subscribe button, like this video, and turn on notifications. Comment "I believe" down below if you think every dog deserves a second chance. You are not going to want to miss a single second of this story. The dog's name was Shadow, though no one in Redstone, Arizona, dared speak it too loudly. Shadow wasn't a pet, at least, not anymore. He was a creature living on borrowed time, confined to a reinforced steel pen at the far edge of the Redstone Animal Rescue Center, right where the civilized world ended and the harsh, unforgiving desert began. The locals called this specific spot the Yard of Lost Causes. It was where the broken, the abused, and the abandoned animals lived out the last of their days when no one else would take them. And among all those damaged creatures, Shadow was the most feared of them all. Shadow's history was whispered about in town, usually in the same breath as words like monster or killer. 2 years earlier, a high-stakes illegal dogfighting ring had been broken up on the outskirts of Phoenix. When the police burst through the doors of a rusted trailer hidden in the scrubland, they found Shadow locked in the back, chained to a steel post in the dark. He wasn't the biggest dog there, but he was the only one who didn't cower. He had fought his captors until the bitter end, his eyes burning with a fury that terrified even the officers. When freedom finally came, it didn't bring him peace. It only brought him more rage. Since arriving in Redstone, every single attempt to rehabilitate him had failed miserably. Professional trainers quit after one session. Volunteers refused to go within 10 feet of his enclosure. Even the local children, who usually loved to peek through the shelter fences, learned to stay away after Shadow lunged at the bars one afternoon with such ferocity that he nearly bent the steel. The head of the shelter was a man named Rick Samuels, a retired police officer with 30 years of experience and a heart made of leather. Rick had seen a lifetime's worth of cruelty, yet even he admitted there was something different about this dog. "He's seen too much darkness," Rick once told a local news reporter who came to do a puff piece on the shelter. "Once an animal learns that kind of fear, it never forgets. That dog has a broken spirit, and I don't think we can fix it." But what Rick didn't know that morning was that Shadow had reached his own breaking point. It was a blistering July afternoon, the kind where the heat rises in shimmering waves off the asphalt and the air tastes like dust. The townsfolk had gathered around the shelter fence for an adoption fair, though everyone kept a wide berth from Shadow's pen. Rick and 2 other handlers were preparing to move Shadow to a secure transport van for a vet checkup. Rick had insisted on thick protective gloves, double harnesses, and a catch pole. Every precaution was taken. Still, as soon as the gate creaked open, chaos erupted. Shadow thrashed violently, tugging at the restraint pole, his teeth bared, his eyes full of something that was neither hate nor pain, but a twisted, frantic mixture of both. He twisted his body like a tornado of fur and muscle. "Careful now, steady. Hold him steady," Rick shouted, sweat dripping down his forehead as he gripped the lead. A loud clang echoed through the yard, sharp and metallic. Then the sound everyone feared, a sickening snap. The heavy iron chain, weakened by years of stress, had shattered. Shadow bolted forward in an explosion of dust. His howl echoed across the yard as the crowd gasped, stumbling backward in a panic. A woman screamed, clutching her child. Someone dropped a crate of supplies. The dog's claws tore through the sand as he charged, the broken chain whipping behind him like a weapon. He was loose. And he was angry. People scattered in every direction, scrambling for the safety of their cars or the shelter office. And then, through the chaos, a lone figure stepped forward. It was a boy. Barefoot, covered in the fine red dust of the valley, his jeans torn at the knees and dragging against the earth. He couldn't have been older than 12. The crowd yelled, "Kid! Get back! Run!" But he didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his small, fragile frame dwarfed by the 80-pound animal rushing toward him. His name was Eli Turner. No one knew where Eli came from exactly. The folks in town called him the Laundromat Kid, because he'd been seen sleeping behind the dumpsters there, or scavenging food from the gas station bins at dawn. He moved through the town like a ghost, talking quietly to stray cats, never asking for money, never speaking to adults. He had no family, no home, and no past that anyone knew of. And now this boy, this invisible forgotten soul, stood face to face with the wildest creature Redstone had ever seen. "Stop. Don't go near him," Rick screamed, dropping the broken pole and sprinting toward the boy. "He'll kill you." But it was already too late. Shadow's snarl deepened into a guttural roar, his muscles tightening for the pounce. His eyes locked onto Eli's, a frightening glassy amber stare that usually promised violence. He lowered his head, tail stiff, teeth flashing white in the sunlight. The crowd held its breath. For a terrifying heartbeat, the world slowed down. Rick was still 20 feet away, too far to help. The dog launched himself forward. And through it all, Eli never flinched. He didn't raise his hands to protect his face. He didn't turn to run. He simply whispered something. A single sentence, spoken so softly that the wind nearly carried it away. His lips barely moved. His eyes never left Shadow's. Then, something impossible happened. Mid-charge, Shadow skidded to a halt. His paws plowed into the dirt, kicking up a cloud of red dust that enveloped them both. His growl, which had been shaking the chests of everyone nearby, suddenly faded into a high-pitched, shaky whine. The giant dog's ears flattened against his skull. His massive frame began to tremble, not with rage, but as if he had been struck by a sudden confusing memory. Murmurs of disbelief spread through the crowd. "What is happening?" someone whispered. It couldn't be real. But it was. Slowly, agonizingly, the monster of Redstone sat down. Rick stopped just short of the boy, his chest heaving, his hand reaching for his radio. "Kid, back away slowly," he warned, his voice trembling. "You got no idea what you're dealing with. That animal is a killer." But Eli didn't move away. He crouched down instead, lowering himself until he was eye level with the beast. The animal's breathing was erratic, his tail twitching nervously in the dirt. Every instinct in Rick's body screamed to tackle the boy and drag him to safety, but something about the absolute calmness radiating from the child rooted everyone to the spot. "You're not angry," Eli said, his voice clear and steady in the silence. "You're just scared. I know. I know what it's like." The crowd went deathly silent. Even the wind seemed to die down. Shadow's panting slowed. He leaned forward, stretching his neck out, his wet nose inching toward the boy's dirty hand. People gasped audibly. The same animal that had destroyed cages, that had shredded Kevlar sleeves, now sat trembling before a homeless child. Eli reached out, just for a second, his tiny grime-stained fingers brushing the thick black fur around Shadow's neck. The dog didn't bite. He didn't back away. Instead, his tail, as if remembering what it once meant to be safe, decades ago in a different life, thumped once in the dirt. And in that moment, a kind of eerie peace settled over the yard. For the first time in 2 years, the demon of the desert was silent. Rick's voice cracked as he finally spoke. How'd you do that, son?" Eli didn't answer immediately. He stood up slowly, brushing the dust off his hands. He looked tired, older than his 12 years. He looked at the dog one last time, and Shadow looked back, not as a predator, but as a protector. "He's not bad," Eli said quietly, looking at Rick. "He just needed someone to say hello." Then, the boy turned and walked toward the open gate, his backpack bouncing against his spine. Shadow watched him go, his amber eyes glued to the boy's silhouette until he disappeared around the corner of the main road. Rick stared at the boy's retreating figure, bewildered. The townsfolk began to chatter excitedly, pulling out their phones, trying to upload the videos they had just taken. They were already calling it a miracle. But Rick wasn't cheering. He was deeply disturbed. He had been a cop for too long to believe in magic. He knew behavior like that didn't just happen. That kind of connection came from somewhere deep. That night, unable to sleep, Rick drove back to the shelter. The desert was cold and bathed in blue moonlight. He needed to check the lock on the pen. He needed to make sure the chain was secure. But when he pulled his truck up to the gate, his headlights swept across the yard and revealed something that made his blood run cold. The pen was wide open. The heavy padlock lay in the dirt, not broken, but unlocked. And the dog was gone. Rick jumped out of the truck, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. He scanned the horizon, his heart hammering in his chest. He swept the light toward the endless stretch of scrubland leading to the river. There in the distance, he saw two sets of footprints in the sand. One set belonged to a massive animal. The other set belonged to a small barefoot child. They were walking side by side, heading straight into the wilderness. Rick stood paralyzed, the beam of his flashlight shaking in his hand. The boy hadn't just tamed the dog for a moment. He had come back for him. And now the town's most dangerous animal and its most vulnerable child were out there, alone, in the unforgiving dark. The silence of the desert night was shattered by the screaming of sirens. Within 20 minutes of Rick finding the empty pen, the Redstone Sheriff's Department had turned the animal shelter into a crime scene. Red and blue lights flashed against the rusted chain-link fences, casting long dancing shadows that looked like ghosts running across the sand. Rick Samuels leaned against the hood of his truck, rubbing his temples as Sheriff Dan Miller slammed his car door and marched over. Miller was a big man, worn down by the sun and 20 years of patrolling a town where nothing ever happened. Until tonight. "Let me get this straight, Rick," Miller said, hitching up his belt. "You're telling me the quietest homeless kid in the county just walked in here, unlocked a cage that takes a master key, and walked off with an 80-pound dog that we all know is a ticking time bomb?" "He didn't break in, Dan," Rick said, his voice low. "The lock wasn't forced. It was opened. And the dog didn't attack him. They left together." Miller shone his flashlight toward the desert darkness. "That dog is a weapon, Rick. You said it yourself 1,000 times. If that animal gets hungry or spooked, or just decides to be what it was trained to be, we aren't looking for a runaway. We're looking for a body." The words hung heavy in the air. Rick knew the sheriff was right on paper, but his gut told him something else. He kept seeing the image of Eli's small hand resting on Shadow's head. There was no fear in that touch. There was only recognition. But try explaining that to a sheriff who saw the world in black and white. By sunrise, the search was a full-scale operation. The story of the laundromat kid stealing the monster of Redstone had hit the morning news. Broadcast vans from Phoenix were already parking along the highway. The narrative was simple and terrifying. A disturbed orphan had kidnapped a dangerous animal, or perhaps, the animal had lured the boy to his doom. Volunteers gathered at the town hall, clutching water bottles and walking sticks. They were people who had walked past Eli every day for a year without looking him in the eye. Now, suddenly, they were desperate to save him. Rick watched them with a bitter taste in his mouth. It took a tragedy to make Eli visible. "We spread out in a grid pattern," the sheriff barked through a megaphone. "Keep your distance if you spot the animal. Do not engage. I repeat, do not engage. That dog is considered lethal." The search teams moved out into the scrubland, drones buzzing overhead like angry hornets. But the Arizona desert is a vast, unforgiving place. It is a landscape of canyons, dry riverbeds, and heat that can kill a grown man in hours, let alone a child with no supplies. Rick took his own truck, bypassing the main search party. He knew where a frightened animal would go. He drove toward the Shadow Canyon Ridge, a jagged scar of red rock 5 miles north. It was treacherous terrain, full of caves and blind drops. As he drove, Rick's mind raced back to the files he had in his office. He had spent the waiting hours digging into Eli's background, hoping to find a next of kin. He found nothing. No birth certificate, no school records in the county. The boy was a ghost. Just like Shadow had been before the raid. 2 ghosts haunting the same town, invisible until they collided. By noon, the temperature hit 102 degrees. The heat shimmered off the rocks, distorting the horizon. Rick parked his truck at the base of the ridge and continued on foot, climbing the steep shale. His radio crackled with updates from the other teams. Nothing. No sightings. No tracks. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Then he saw it. About 300 yards down into a ravine, tucked beneath the overhang of a limestone cliff, there was a flash of movement. Rick dropped to his stomach, pulling out his binoculars. He adjusted the focus, his breath catching in his throat. It was them. Eli was sitting cross-legged in the shade of the rock. Shadow was lying beside him, his massive head resting in the boy's lap. But it was what Eli was doing that made Rick's heart ache. The boy was holding a plastic water bottle, one he must have scavenged from a trash bin, and he was pouring the water into his own cupped hand, offering it to the dog. Eli took a sip only after Shadow had finished. The boy wiped the dog's eyes with the sleeve of his dirty shirt, checking him for ticks or thorns. He was murmuring to the animal, rocking back and forth slightly. Shadow, the beast who had snapped a steel chain yesterday, looked completely submissive. He looked humble. He nudged Eli's chest with his nose, and the boy wrapped his thin arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the fur. They didn't look like a captive and a captor. They looked like two soldiers resting in a trench. Rick keyed his radio, his thumb hovering over the button. He knew the protocol. He should call in the coordinates. The sheriff would send the tactical team. They would tranquilize Shadow, maybe worse if he moved too fast, and they would grab Eli. They would separate them. They would put Shadow down as a public safety risk and put Eli in the foster system that had likely failed him before. Rick looked through the binoculars again. He saw Eli smile. It was the first time he had ever seen the kid smile. Rick lowered the radio. He couldn't do it. Not yet. But the desert had other plans. The wind suddenly shifted. The dry heat vanished, replaced instantly by a heavy wet pressure in the air. Rick looked up. Over the mountain peaks to the north, the sky had turned a bruised, angry purple. Monsoon season. In Arizona, the storms don't warn you. They simply arrive. And they bring the deadliest threat of the desert, flash floods. Rick looked back down at the ravine. Eli and Shadow were resting in the wash, the dry riverbed that carved through the canyon. It was the coolest place to be in the heat, but when the rain hit the mountains 10 miles away, the dry bed would turn into a raging torrent of mud and debris within minutes. A wall of water moving at 40 miles an hour, crushing everything in its path. Eli! Rick screamed, abandoning his cover. He scrambled down the loose rocks, waving his arms. Get out of the wash. Move. The wind snatched his voice away. Thunder cracked, shaking the ground beneath Rick's boots. The sky opened up, dumping a curtain of rain so thick it blurred the world into gray static. Down in the canyon, Shadow's ears pricked up. He stood instantly, barking at the sky. Eli looked around, confused, grabbing his backpack. He didn't see the danger. He didn't know that the rumble in the ground wasn't thunder anymore, it was the water coming. Rick scrambled down the slope, sliding, cutting his hands on the mesquite brush. Get up the bank. Now. Shadow heard him. The dog turned, locking eyes with Rick high up on the ridge. And then, the dog did something extraordinary. He didn't run away from the approaching sound of the water. He grabbed the back of Eli's shirt in his teeth and yanked him hard toward the canyon wall. But Eli slipped. And then, with a roar that sounded like a freight train, the water arrived. A massive brown wall of sludge, tree limbs, and boulders smashed around the bend of the canyon. Rick watched in horror as the floodwaters surged toward the boy and the dog. No! Rick screamed. The water hit them. In a split second, the boy and the beast were swept off their feet, swallowed instantly by the churning, violent river of mud. Rick fell to his knees on the ridge, the rain pounding against his back, staring at the empty spot where they had just been standing. They were gone. The roar of the flash flood was deafening, a sound so deep it vibrated in Rick's chest like a second heartbeat. Below him, the canyon floor had vanished. Where there had been dry sand and scrub brush only moments ago, a brown, violent river now churned, smashing boulders against the canyon walls and snapping tree trunks like matchsticks. Rick scrambled down the slippery shale slope, ignoring the sharp rocks tearing at his jeans and hands. Eli! Shadow! He screamed, but his voice was swallowed instantly by the chaos of the storm. The rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the red dirt into slick clay. Rick reached the edge of the raging water, his flashlight beam cutting uselessly through the deluge. The flood was moving too fast. If they were in the main channel, they were already miles downstream, or worse, buried beneath the silt. His radio crackled to life, Sheriff Miller's voice cutting through the static. Samuels. We've got reports of heavy flooding in Shadow Canyon. Pull your team back. It's too dangerous. Rick grabbed the radio, pressing the button so hard his knuckles turned white. They're in the water, Dan. I saw them go under. I need a chopper now. Are you crazy? Miller's voice cracked. Nothing can fly in this storm. Get to high ground, Rick. That's an order. Rick stared at the churning mud. He thought of Eli's small, fragile body. He thought of Shadow, the dog everyone said was a killer, trying to pull the boy to safety right before the impact. I'm not leaving them, Rick whispered, shoving the radio back into his belt. He began to run along the bank, slipping and stumbling, eyes scanning the swirling debris. The water was rising fast, eating away at the ground beneath his boots. Every log that bobbed to the surface looked like a body. Every dark shape looked like a dog. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. No one could survive that initial impact. The force of the water alone was enough to crush bones. Rick rounded a sharp bend in the canyon where the walls widened out. Here the water spread and slowed slightly, swirling into deep, murky eddies near the banks. And then he saw it. Caught in a tangle of uprooted mesquite roots about 50 yards downstream, a black shape was fighting the current. It was Shadow. The dog's head bobbed above the surface, gasping for air. He was thrashing wildly, his paws clawing at the muddy water. But he wasn't trying to swim to the shore. He was trying to swim upstream. He was fighting the entire force of the flood, growling and biting at the water, refusing to let the current take him. Rick squinted through the rain. Why wasn't he saving himself? Then Rick saw a flash of blue fabric. Eli. The boy was limp, his backpack strap tangled in the submerged roots of the mesquite tree. The current was hammering him, pushing him under, rolling him over. He wasn't moving. Shadow had his teeth clamped onto the shoulder of Eli's jacket. The dog was using every ounce of his massive strength to keep the boy's head above the water, paddling furiously against the deadly flow. But the tree roots were giving way. The flood was winning. Hang on. Rick roared. He didn't think. He didn't check the depth. He jumped. The cold water hit him like a sledgehammer, knocking the breath out of his lungs. The current grabbed his legs and yanked him downstream. Rick fought, kicking hard, angling his body toward the tangle of roots. Debris slammed into his shoulder, a branch, a rock, but he kept his eyes on the dog. Shadow saw him coming. The dog didn't growl. He didn't snap. He let out a sharp, desperate bark, his eyes wide with panic. He was drowning, dragged down by the weight of the boy and the force of the river, but he refused to let go. Rick reached the tree, grabbing a thick branch with one hand. The wood groaned under the strain. With his other hand, he reached for Eli. Grab him. Rick yelled at the dog, though he knew Shadow couldn't understand. Let go, I've got him. Rick's fingers closed around the strap of Eli's backpack. He pulled, his muscles burning. Shadow, realizing help had arrived, finally released his grip on the jacket but immediately shoved his snout under Eli's arm, pushing him up, helping Rick lift the dead weight. Working together, man and beast, they hauled the unconscious boy onto the muddy bank. Rick collapsed into the mud, gasping for air. Shadow dragged himself out of the water and collapsed beside them, heaving, coughing up water. Rick crawled over to Eli. The boy's face was pale, blue-lipped. He wasn't breathing. No, 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 Rick muttered, panic rising in his throat. He turned Eli onto his back and started chest compressions. Come on, kid. Don't do this. Breathe. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. Shadow pulled himself closer. He didn't shake the water off his coat. He crawled on his belly until his nose was touching Eli's cheek. He let out a low, mournful whine that cut through the sound of the storm. He licked the boy's face, frantic, nudging him hard. Come on, Eli. Rick shouted, pumping the small chest again. Shadow suddenly barked, a sharp, commanding sound right in Eli's ear. A gasp. Water erupted from Eli's mouth. The boy convulsed, coughing violently, his whole body seizing as air rushed back into his lungs. Rick rolled him onto his side, rubbing his back. That's it. Get it out. You're okay. I've got you. Eli opened his eyes. They were hazy, unfocused. He looked up at the rain-soaked sky, then at Rick. Then he turned his head. Shadow. His voice was a tiny, raspy croak. The giant dog let out a sound that was half whimper, half howl, and laid his heavy head directly on Eli's chest. Eli's shaking hand came up to grip the dog's fur. Rick sat back in the mud, wiping rain from his eyes. He looked at the two of them, the homeless boy and the killer dog, clinging to each other in the aftermath of disaster. They had saved each other. Again. But the danger wasn't over. The storm was intensifying. The water level was still rising, inching up the bank toward them. They were trapped on a narrow ledge of rock with sheer cliffs behind them and a raging river in front. There was no way out on foot. Rick grabbed his radio again. It was soaked, blinking a weak red light. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Samuels. I have the boy. We are stranded in the lower wash. Rising water. We need immediate extraction. Do you copy?" Static. Then, a faint voice. "Copy. Samuels. Chopper is 5 minutes out. Hold tight." Rick looked at Eli. "Did you hear that? Help is coming." Eli didn't answer. He was staring at something behind Rick, his eyes wide with fear. Rick turned around. Coming down the cliff face behind them wasn't a rescue team. It was a mountain lion. Displaced by the flood, hungry and cornered, the cougar crouched on a rock shelf 10 feet above them. Its ears were pinned back, its tail twitching. It saw 3 exhausted, vulnerable prey trapped against the water. Rick's hand went to his hip. His holster was empty. He had left his firearm in the truck. He scrambled for a rock, a stick, anything. But the cougar was already coiling its muscles to spring. Shadow saw it too. The dog, exhausted and half-drowned, stood up. He staggered slightly, his legs shaking from fatigue. But he didn't back down. He stepped in front of Eli, shielding the boy with his body. The fur along his spine stood straight up. A low, vibrating growl started deep in his chest, a sound far more terrifying than the thunder. The monster of Redstone had returned. But this time, he wasn't fighting for himself. The cougar hissed, baring its fangs. Shadow didn't wait. With a roar of pure defiance, the rescue dog launched himself up the rock face toward the predator. The collision was brutal. Shadow slammed into the mountain lion midair, a chaotic blur of fur, claws, and teeth. The impact knocked the predator backward off the rock shelf, and both animals tumbled down the slippery slope, landing in the mud just feet from where Eli lay. "Shadow!" Eli screamed, trying to push himself up, but his body was too weak. Rick grabbed a heavy piece of driftwood, stepping in front of the boy. "Stay back, Eli. Stay down." The cougar was faster, leaner, and armed with razor-sharp claws that could disembowel a deer in seconds. It twisted in the mud, hissing violently, and swiped at Shadow's face. Blood sprayed across the wet sand. Shadow didn't flinch. He didn't yelp. He lunged again, his jaws snapping shut on the cat's shoulder, shaking his head with a ferocity that belonged to a wild animal, not a pet. This wasn't a dogfight. This was a war. The cougar shrieked, rolling onto its back, raking its hind claws against Shadow's chest. Shadow was heavy, built for power, but he was exhausted from the flood. He stumbled, his grip slipping on the wet fur. The cat seized the moment, scrambling free and leaping onto a higher boulder, poised to strike again. Its yellow eyes weren't locked on the dog anymore. They were locked on the small, shivering boy behind him. The predator knew the weak link. The cat tensed its muscles to spring over Shadow, straight for Eli. Shadow saw the gaze shift. He knew. With a snarl that sounded like metal tearing, Shadow threw himself backward, not attacking, but blocking. He stood directly over Eli, bracing his legs in the mud, turning his throat toward the predator. He was offering himself as the shield. "Take me," his stance said. "You don't touch him." The cougar sprang. Bang. A deafening crack echoed through the canyon. The mountain lion twisted in midair, letting out a yowl of surprise, and scrambled frantically up the cliff face, disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness. Rick spun around. 50 feet above them, on the ridge line, stood Sheriff Miller, a smoking rifle in his hands. Beside him, searchlights from a rescue helicopter cut through the gloom, illuminating the canyon floor in blinding white beams. "Clear the area." Miller's voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Get that boy out of there." A rescue basket descended from the chopper, swaying in the wind. A medic dropped down, sliding through the mud to reach them. "Check the kid. Check the kid first." Rick yelled, pointing at Eli. The medic knelt beside Eli, checking his vitals. "Pulse is weak, hypothermia setting in. We need to move him now." They strapped Eli into the basket. The boy fought them weakly, reaching his hand out. "No. Shadow, don't leave him." "We'll get him, son. I promise," Rick said, gripping Eli's shoulder. "I won't leave him." As the basket lifted Eli into the air, Rick turned to Shadow. The dog was lying in the mud, panting heavily. His side was matted with blood, deep claw marks raking his ribs. His right ear was torn. He looked at Rick, then up at the ascending basket. He let out a soft whine. "You did good, buddy," Rick whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt down and clipped a rescue line around Shadow's chest harness. "You did good." 2 hours later, the waiting room of the Redstone Medical Center was silent. The storm outside had passed, leaving only a steady, quiet drizzle. Rick sat in a plastic chair, still wearing his muddy clothes, a paper cup of coffee untouched in his hands. Sheriff Miller stood by the window, looking uncomfortable. "How's the boy?" Miller asked quietly. "Stable," Rick said. "Doctors say he'll make it. A few broken ribs, severe exposure, but he's tough." "And the dog?" Rick looked up. "Vet's stitching him up now. 30 stitches. He lost a lot of blood." Miller sighed, taking off his hat. "Rick, you know what happens next, right? I saw what happened out there. I know he saved the kid. But the law is the law. That dog is an unregistered animal involved in a violent incident. He has a history. The county isn't going to let a homeless kid keep a pit mix that fights mountain lions." Rick stood up slowly. "He didn't attack a person, Dan. He saved a life." "I know," Miller said, looking down. "But without an owner, without a license, he goes back to the state kennels. And with his record? They'll put him down, Rick. He's unadoptable." Rick clenched his jaw. "Over my dead body." Miller shook his head. "Check the files, Rick. Unless you can prove that dog belongs to someone responsible, someone with a clean record, my hands are tied." Rick walked away. He went straight to his office at the shelter, ignoring the closed sign. He unlocked the filing cabinet where he kept the old case files, the ones from the dogfighting raid 2 years ago. He needed something. Anything. A connection. He pulled the box labeled Operation Broken Chain. Dust motes danced in the fluorescent light. He flipped through the gruesome photos of the raid, dogs in chains, betting slips, weapons. Then he froze. He found a small, crumpled manila envelope at the bottom of the box. It was labeled Evidence, Personal Effects Found on Site. Inside was a single, Polaroid photograph. Rick held it up to the light. The photo was grainy, taken inside the trailer where the ring operated. In the background, men were gambling. But in the corner, sitting on a dirty mattress, was a woman. She looked tired, terrified. And in her lap sat a small boy, maybe 6 years old. The boy was holding a puppy. A black and tan puppy with a distinct white mark on its chest. Rick's heart hammered. He looked closer at the boy in the photo. Even younger, even cleaner, it was Eli. He flipped the photo over. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Eli and Shadow, keep them safe." Rick dropped the photo onto the desk. Eli hadn't just found a stray dog. He hadn't just tamed a wild beast. Shadow was his dog. The pieces slammed together in Rick's mind. Eli's mother must have been involved with the ring, maybe against her will, maybe trying to survive. She had hidden her son there. And in that hellhole, the boy and the puppy had been each other's only comfort. When the police raided the place, chaos had erupted. The mother died in the crossfire. Rick remembered the report now. The boy must have run away in the confusion, terrified of the police. And the dog was taken by animal control, labeled a monster, and thrown into a cage. For 2 years, they had been searching for each other. Eli didn't run away from the shelter because he was crazy. He ran away because he had finally found the only family he had left. Rick grabbed the photo and the file. He had the proof. He could save them. He grabbed his keys and ran out to his truck. He had to get to the hospital. He had to tell Eli that he knew. But as he pulled out of the shelter parking lot, his phone buzzed. It was the vet clinic. "Rick." The vet's voice was urgent. "You need to get here. Now." "Is he okay? Did Shadow make it?" Rick asked, speeding onto the main road. "He's alive," the vet said, her voice trembling. "But Rick, the police are here. They aren't waiting for the hearing. They have a court order for immediate euthanasia. They say he's too dangerous to be kept in a medical facility." Stall them. Rick shouted, slamming his foot on the gas. Do not let them touch that dog. I can't stop them, Rick. They're loading him up right now. Rick swerved around a corner, tires screeching. He was 5 minutes away. Rick, the vet whispered. They aren't taking him to the kennel. They're taking him to the back lot. The line went dead. Rick stared at the road ahead, his heart pounding in his throat. They were going to kill Shadow. After everything, after the flood, the cougar, the miracle in the desert, they were going to execute him in the dark like a criminal. Rick floored the accelerator. The engine roared. He wasn't going to let it happen. Not tonight. Not ever. But as the clinic came into view, he saw the flashing lights of the animal control van pulling around the side of the building. He was too late. Rick's truck screeched into the clinic parking lot, kicking up gravel as he slammed the brakes. He didn't bother parking properly. He threw the door open and sprinted toward the back of the building, his boots pounding against the pavement. The flashing lights of the animal control van illuminated the brick wall in a rhythmic, sickening pulse of orange and yellow. 2 officers stood by the open doors of the van. Between them, on a stretcher, lay Shadow. The dog was sedated, his massive chest rising and falling in slow, heavy breaths, bandages wrapped tightly around his torso. A third man, the county supervisor, a bureaucrat named Henderson, was holding a syringe. Stop. Rick roared, his voice cracking with desperation. Don't you touch him. Henderson looked up, startled. Samuels? This is a restricted area. Back off. You don't have the authority to do this, Rick panted, stepping between the men and the dog. This animal is a hero. He saved a child's life tonight. He's a liability, Henderson snapped, checking his clipboard. Unregistered, violent history, involved in an attack on wildlife. The order came from the top. We're doing this for public safety. Public safety? Rick laughed bitterly, pulling the crumpled manila envelope from his jacket pocket. You want to talk about safety? Look at this. He shoved the Polaroid photo into Henderson's chest. That's not a stray dog, Rick said, his voice shaking with fury. And that boy in the hospital isn't just some homeless kid. That is his owner. They were separated 2 years ago during the raid. This dog belongs to Eli Turner. You kill that dog, and you are destroying the only property, the only family, that boy has left. And I promise you, Henderson, if you push that plunger, I will make sure every news station from here to New York sees this photo and knows exactly who killed the hero of Redstone. Henderson froze. He looked at the photo, the grainy image of the small boy and the puppy. He looked at the sedated dog, whose scarred face looked peaceful for the first time in years. He looked back at Rick's blazing eyes. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The orange lights continued to flash. Henderson slowly lowered the syringe. He handed the photo back to Rick. You have 24 hours to file the paperwork, Henderson muttered, signaling the officers to back down. If that dog isn't registered, vaccinated, and licensed by tomorrow noon, we come back. Rick exhaled, his knees nearly buckling with relief. He will be. The next morning, the sun rose over Redstone, bathing the desert in a soft golden light that made the red rocks glow. The storm had scrubbed the world clean. The air smelled of sagebrush and wet earth. Inside the hospital room, Eli lay awake. He was clean bandaged, and wearing a hospital gown that was 3 sizes too big. He stared at the ceiling, his eyes hollow. He didn't know what had happened. He remembered the flood, the cat, the helicopter, and then nothing. The door creaked open. Eli turned his head sharply. Rick stood in the doorway. He was smiling. And he wasn't alone. Beside him, limping slightly but walking under his own power, was Shadow. Shadow! Eli cried out, his voice raspy. The dog didn't wait for a command. He pulled gently on the leash, hobbling over to the bed. He rested his chin carefully on the mattress, avoiding the tubes and wires, and let out a deep, contented sigh. Eli wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the thick fur. He began to sob great, heaving sobs that shook his small frame. Shadow closed his eyes and licked the tears from the boy's cheek. Rick stood by the window, watching them. He wiped his own eyes, then cleared his throat. Eli, Rick said softly, we need to talk. The boy looked up, fear flashing in his eyes. Are you going to take him away? No, Rick said firmly. Nobody is ever taking him away again. He pulled a chair close to the bed. I found something, Eli. I found the photo. Eli went still. I know you knew him before, Rick said gentle. I know about the trailer. I know about your mom. Eli looked down at his hands, twisting the hospital sheet. She told me to hide him, he whispered. When the bad men came, she said, keep Shadow safe. But I lost him. I ran away, and I lost him. You didn't lose him, kid, Rick said. You found him. You saved him. And he saved you. Rick reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of papers. I had a talk with the sheriff. And the social worker. It turns out, there's a retired police officer in this town who has a big empty house and a fenced-in yard. And he's looking to foster a kid. And a dog. Eli's eyes went wide. You. If you'll have me, Rick smiled. But there are rules. You go to school. You do your homework. And you help me train Shadow. Deal. Eli looked at Rick. Then he looked at Shadow, who thumped his tail against the bed frame. Deal, Eli whispered. 6 months later. The sun was setting over the canyon ridge, painting the sky in streaks of violet and orange. A cool breeze drifted up from the valley floor. Rick sat on the porch of his ranch house, watching the yard. Eli was throwing a tennis ball. He looked different now, taller, healthier, his cheeks filled out. He was laughing, a sound that rang clear and bright in the evening air. Shadow bounded across the grass. His scars were still there, hidden under a glossy, healthy coat, but his limp was gone. He caught the ball in midair and trotted back to the boy, dropping it at his feet. He didn't cower. He didn't snarl. He sat, waiting for the next throw, his eyes bright and alert. The town of Redstone had changed, too. The story of the boy and his dog had spread far beyond the county lines. Donations had poured into the shelter, allowing them to build a new wing for rehabilitation. Shadow had become a local celebrity, a symbol of second chances. But to Eli, he wasn't a symbol. He was just Shadow. Rick took a sip of his iced tea. He thought about the chain that had snapped that day in the shelter. He used to think it broke because the metal was weak. Now, he knew better. It broke because some bonds are stronger than steel. It broke because love, when pushed into a corner, will always fight its way out. Eli waved at him from the yard. Hey Rick. Watch this. Eli held up his hand, palm open. Shadow sat instantly. Shake, Eli said. The giant paw, the one that had fought off a mountain lion, lifted gently and placed itself in the boy's hand. Rick smiled. They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. They say you can't fix what's broken. They say some people and some animals are just lost causes. But looking at the boy and the beast, standing together in the golden light of the Arizona sunset, Rick knew the truth. Nothing is ever truly lost. It's just waiting to be found. Thank you for listening to this incredible story of survival, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his dog. If this story touched your heart, please do me a favor, hit that like button right now. It helps us share these stories with more people who need a little hope today. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. We have more amazing stories coming your way every week. Now, I have a question for you. Do you believe that animals remember the people they love, even after years apart? Let me know your answer in the comments section below. I read every single one. Until next time, remember to be kind, be brave, and never give up on the ones you love.